Everyone, so share my screen. So can you all see slides?
Yes,
Okay,
that's perfect.
brilliant,
Yep.
wonderful. Thanks. Yeah, so thanks a lot for the invitation to speak at the Protein Eye seminar series and for that very nice introduction. It's great to be part of the scientific advisory group or committee for the Protein Eye project as well. So as Lorraine mentioned in the introduction, my background is rural and food geography. So this talk is probably more situated in the sort of social science of alternative proteins and the protein transition. So that's sort of where I'm coming from. And I'm going to start with just a few introductory remarks. So what I want to do is just briefly contextualize where I'm coming from. So the first comment is just to emphasize that this work on protein transitions is situated in the context of what I would call sort of planetary concern. So in other words, there's a series of questions now being raised about the sustainability of our food systems, or rather the unsustainability of our food systems, and the need to radically change some of the directions that our food systems are going in. And one of that directions is to, if you like, question the animal derived aspect of where we get our protein from. So we now have emerging discourses around ideas like demeatification. And in that context, the protein transition, which is basically about changing from those kind of animal-based protein economies to more, if you like, plant-based or cellular alternative economies or alternative proteins, has stimulated quite a lot of interest, both in the kind of industry itself, but also within the academic community. So in today's talk, I want to talk a little bit about that. And I want to, in particular, show you the kind of multiple protein alternatives that are out there. So moving beyond some of the discussion about, for example, laboratory meats and some of the associated, what I would call social and technical histories of those proteins. So I'm going to do that, and in the process ask some questions about who's investing in alternative proteins and what do these investment geographies tell us about the protein transition in food systems. And then at the final part of the talk, soon I haven't run out of time, I want to think about an alternative framing for the protein transition, which perhaps is a little bit more in keeping with the underlying ambitions of Protein Eye, but thinking about it much more in terms of a farmer-led transition and how we might support that. So I've got lots to talk about, but I'll try and there's some detail in the slides, but I'm going to try and give you hopefully a nice introductory feel, so it's not too heavy on sort of like social science theory. That's the aim anyway. So just to set the scene, then, this is from a paper that we've recently produced, which I'll draw on a little bit later, but it just gives you an indication of the interest. So this is based on some analysis of UK media. As you can see, that's from 1984 through to 2021, where we looked at, for this to build this particular graph, 15 national UK newspapers, broadsheet and tabloid. And we basically chucked in some of those words around things like cultured meat, fake meat, veganism, vegetarian. You can see actually how interest in these particular aspects of our food system and the alternative protein economies has really risen, particularly in the last sort of 10 or 20 years, quite significant spikes of interest in that. And some of that is related, we think, to things like, popular documentaries on, things like cow conspiracy and stuff, but also things like sort of celebrities and all sorts of things, as well as public discourse around the sustainability of our food system. That just sets the scene a little bit in terms of that context. But there's a much bigger context, and this is about putting protein in what I would call the Anthropocene, So this is a scientific concept, an Earth system concept, but it's also one that's become a lot very interesting to food system social science scholars in recent years. And you know, people on the call today will know some of this, but the point is that we now have a situation where the food system is intensely bound up with bigger questions around, for example, climate change and the relationship between certain forms of agriculture and the problems that creates in terms of climate change. There's a really good book about net zero and food systems by Neil Ward, where in his opening chapter he talks about the need for a radical transition in the 21st century, both in terms of the land use practices, the farming practices, and our food system. And of course, these things are not only about climate change and net zero, it's also about a number of other planetary boundaries that we're exceeding at the moment. So I became quite interested in the sort of protein stuff, partly as a response to this Eat Lancet Commission report that was published in 2019. And I'll show you that in a moment. But what's happening within sort of social science now and rural and food geography in particular is a kind of situation where we're trying to link food into some of these bigger kind of planetary questions and Earth system questions and think about what the implications are that from a kind of social science perspective. So just to show you a couple of the key slides from the Eat Lancet report, which I'm not going to go through the detail because you'll know it much better than me, but in that report it was quite interesting because firstly they were linking food systems to 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries, and you can see them here on this slide, the Earth system processes, and essentially requiring really a radical shift in the way that we consume food and the types of food that we consume, with recommendations particularly for a more plant-based dietary pattern, as they say, a dramatic shift in things like that, but also food waste and agricultural production practices as well. So that's the first target. This is the other well-known target that they present in that report, the healthy diet, where you have basically a kind of revised healthy plate, half of which is made up of fruit and vegetables. And then on the other side, you can see the composition of protein, and animal source and dairy proteins are significantly reduced. So obviously this report was very interesting. It was quite controversial, but I found it quite interesting as a kind of way into some of these discussions. But I also want to just give you a flavour of some of the other social science work that's going on around this stuff. So I read in particular some work around laboratory meats. This is kind of cellular agriculture stuff, and related plant-based proteins. So you can see here, I posed the question, is it lab-based? That's slightly provocative, but there's been some really good work done by a lady called Alex Sexton, who's based at Sheffield University at the moment. She's produced a series of very interesting social science papers on different aspects of the protein transition. And you can see some of the definitions there around things like cellular agriculture, for example, and sort of cell science techniques related to that. But what's quite interesting in the work that, for example, Alex has done is thinking about these proteins in terms of what they call promissory narratives. So this idea of the promises that are associated with some of these new protein technologies. So it's not so much what they are doing, but potentially what they could do for the future of our food system. So in their 2019 paper, they've got a really nice diagram that I sometimes refer to in different talks, which is looking at, in this diagram, the relationship between the promissory narrative. So this is the promises of the alternative protein. So that's on the left-hand side, things like healthier bodies, feeding the world, meat that tastes like animals. but then also looking at the counter narratives that have emerged from the livestock industry, of which there are three. So one is simply to suggest that it's not really a serious threat, that these innovations will never really take hold. Also questioning the very legitimacy of it as a food, so that it's not real, and also that it's not legally defined. So there's a kind of battle, if you like, going on between the kind of alternative protein and the counter narrative of the livestock industry. And what they argue is that there's a set of kind of underlying cultural values that have been around for quite a long time that are kind of flashpoints in this discussion. So real food versus fake food, clean food versus dirty food, and this kind of binary between tradition and progress. So I became really interested in this kind of area of work, inspired partly by the Lancet report, which is more so sciencey, if you like, and then some of the emerging work in the social sciences, which was looking at promissory narratives. But just to say that there's quite a lot of work now going on in social science, which is looking at some of these new alternative economies. So one framing is to look at kind of promissory narrative side, but there's some other work going on, which is even more critical, I would say, of the whole nature of these economies. And it links into some much bigger frameworks that have been used by, for example, the famous work of Polanyi. So in the Eat Lancet report, they actually reference the title of his book in their recommendations. So I thought it might be quite cool to weave in a reference here. But one of the things that Polanyi talks about is this idea of counter movements, and a relationship, a kind of dialectic relationship, if you like, between kind of markets and societal discourses and discussions. But one of the things Polanyi talks about is that sometimes you can get the market will actually respond to countervailing discourses. So what that means is that basically these alternative protein economies could actually be seen as a response by the market to some of those bigger questions about the sustainability of the food system. And there's been some really good work done by a guy called Phil Howard, who's I think he's a sociology professor in the United States, particularly looking at cellular agriculture. And he's quite critical of the whole thing. He's done an awful lot of work on kind of power, the role of power in food systems. And he basically argues that these new technologies will kind of reinforce a lot of the power dynamics that we already have in our food systems. So inspired by that work, we've been doing some of our own work looking at alternative protein economies and looking at them particularly from a business perspective and what we call a big business perspective. So looking at questions of rather than looking at promissory narratives, looking at the development trajectories of specific proteins. So let me just show you some slides on that. So this is a paper that was published in the Proceeding of the National Academy of Sciences last year, and I could circulate it later on if people are interested. And what we were really trying to do in that paper was to do an empirical analysis of 4 alternative proteins, and then to look at that, the development trajectory of those, alongside what we call the animal agriculture regime. So this is using a particular body of social science work, which is transition theory, and specifically multi-level perspective analysis, which you don't need to worry about too much. But basically, in multi-level terms, it's about the relationship between the mainstream regime, which is the animal agriculture regime, and what are called niche innovations. So these alternative proteins are niche innovations. And you also have what are called landscape pressures. So pressures from outside the food system that might be also disrupting it. And in the paper, what we try to do is to look at 4 particular alternative protein innovations. We look at plant-based meats, single cell proteins, which is basically corn, precision cellular fermentations, and then cultured meat. So we look at 4 of these rather than just looking at one, and look at their trajectories. And I've got some slides that shows you a little bit of the detail of that story. But one of the things that it shows is an intensification in corporate engagement. Now, what that means in simple terms is that some of the big meat companies are becoming interested in these alternative protein economies. And in this literature that we've been using, these are called incumbent actors. And it's quite interesting that that's happening. It means that there is some form of, if you like, destabilization in the agricultural regime. But also our analysis shows some differences in these proteins given their relative technological maturity. And you'll see also a redefinition of protein, which is particularly interesting. So they're the kind of highlight messages from the paper. And then in the paper itself, we work through this emerging alternative protein transition, which starts off with an analysis of the niche innovations themselves. So we do it basically over a 30-year period. And what the analysis shows is that they started off quite slowly, what we call slow emergence. And in the last sort of 10, 20 years, there's been a real acceleration of interest. So if you go back to like 1990, a lot of these companies they were basically SMEs, were quite small niche companies. Most of it was around plant-based and some of the developments on the corn side. What is really interesting is that in the sort of the middle part of the period, so 2000 to 2013, the discussion, so the external discussions about climate change were particularly influential. And some of the reports, there was a report done by the FAO, for example, which was about the long shadow of livestock, and things like that. Reports like that became very influential for some of these founding companies of some of these alternative protein markets. And they often actually cited reports like that. And then what we see in the latter period of our analysis is an acceleration for some of the market niches. So what's particularly interesting is that the kind of plant-based proteins in particular, there's been a lot of interest in, a lot of growth in those. And actually they've been absorbed into things like food service, for example. So if you look in, like the development of some of these meat substitute burgers and things in McDonald's and stuff like that. So the food service sector has absorbed it and so forth. But some of them less so. Corn remains just something that's done by one single firm, for example, probably because of the branding and stuff. So there's some really interesting analysis in that part of the paper. And then what we do is we compare that with what's actually happening in the animal food regime itself over the last 20 years or so. And what we think it shows is what we call a kind of partial destabilization. So again, a bit sciencey, social sciencey, but also a tentative reorientation. I don't think it's going to see a major reorientation, but there is some diversification. So in the regime has seen a lot of landscape pressures, particularly in relation to climate change, but also concerns around things like food security. But if you look at things like the flow of economic resources, we don't think it indicates a sector that's in crisis. So actually at a global level, it's still doing quite well. Meat demand globally still remains quite high, for instance. And if you look at things like subsidy and stuff, there's still a lot of subsidy going into into livestock agriculture. On the public legitimacy side, which is another way that you see if the change is happening, again, there's some questioning, particularly in sort of more developed market economies, about whether we should shift from our diets to be more plant-based. But actually, there still is quite a lot of political support for livestock, for example. Where it gets particularly interesting is this third point, which is around, do we detect decreasing commitment to the regime by incumbent actors? And actually what we found, looking at this data that we've been using, is that some of the biggest meat companies have started to become interested in some of these alternative protein economies. So I'll show you this table, and you'll probably look at it and think, I can't even read that, which is, why is he showing me this? But this is a table that we built for the paper, which took quite a long time. But the interesting part of it particularly, so some of these companies, like Kellogg's, for example, have always had quite a history of being interested in some of these plant-based markets. But if you go down to the bottom of the table, these are some of the biggest meat companies in the world. So JPS is based in Brazil, for example, one of the world's largest meat processors. They've become interested in plant-based products. Tyson and Cargill, who are, I think, both based in the US. Again, Tyson is the second largest meat processor. They've become interested and have started to invest in things like Beyond Meat, Upside Meat, Future Meat Technologies. So in the multi-level analysis literature, when incumbent actors become interested in these niches, it's quite a significant sign that there is something going on. So I sound like I'm sort of some kind of detective or something, but basically what we're suggesting is that you can use this broader theoretical framework as a way to read this transition. So what we see in it are kind of accelerated changes, but also differences between those alternative protein economies. So there has been quite a lot of technological progress, particularly for the plant-based and more recently the latter two that I was referring to. So the sort of cellular example, and the precision one. But what the analysis shows is that they diffuse differently. They all have their own trajectories. They're not all the same thing, basically. And the other crucial thing is the market for them is still very small compared to conventional animal proteins. So we have to be careful that we don't get too carried away with our kind of assessment, basically. But there is definitely something really interesting happening, and that relates to this broader relationship between the regime itself and these landscape pressures. So particularly the discussion around climate change, probably more so than some of those other planetary boundaries that I was referring to at the start of the talk. So that's, I think I'm actually fine for time. So that gives you a quick overview of the kind of alternative protein economy side of the story. And so what we've done is I've given you a kind of overview of the social science that's been done by other colleagues, and then some of our own work, which has been done in relation to looking at multiple alternative proteins and their kind of what we call them development trajectories. What I want to do in this final part of the talk is, well, I've called it's a bit more of a kind of thought experiment, but basically the analysis previously is looking at quite technocentric, big investment, global agriculture type of thinking. What I want to do to link it a little bit more directly to Protein I is to think, can we think of a protein transition in a way that's perhaps a little bit more farmer-led and maybe less, shall we say, technocentric, maybe more socio-ecological, for example? So to do that, one way we can think about that is about how do we enact change in the food system? So how do we create tipping points that might trigger change? And there are different ways that you can do that. One is you can create a body of evidence, which hopefully is what Protein I is going to be doing. Secondly, you can do a kind of visioning process. So you can create a vision for a future that gets people on board. And thirdly, you can connect it to existing social movements that might be able to challenge some of those power dynamics that we face in some mainstream kind of agricultural commodity sectors. So the question I've posed to myself, but also perhaps to all of us, is can we reframe the alternative protein agenda? Can we make it less technocentric and more farmer-led? And to help me to do that, I've to help us think through this process, I want to show you some data from a report that I think is actually going to come out today, but we've just finished a big farm survey, and I want to show you a slide from that, which is quite interesting. I've also been looking at this EU Agriculture Outlook forecasting data, because a lot of the analysis I've presented up to now is quite UK based or US and global, so give it a bit of an EU lens. And one way I think we could do it also is to link to things like the local food movement and the short food supply chain type economies that probably never gets thought about as having a presence in this type of space, but I really think they should. So this is some data that we collected as part of quite a big survey of farms in England for a project which is called the National Innovation Centre for Rural Enterprise. So our university and myself are associated with that programme of work here in England. And we've just completed a survey in 3 regions. And one of the things that we were interested in, so we were asking the farmers about the cost of doing business at the moment, which is pretty rubbish, to be honest, and very difficult. But we were also asking them about kind of things they might want to think about in the future, one of which was around shorter food supply chains. So these are effectively more direct marketing channels. And the responses were actually quite interesting, because I've highlighted there in bold, for instance, we got generally quite a high response rate, although the yes number was generally quite high across all 3 groups that we were interested in. But it was particularly high in the crop sector, more so than I would have anticipated. And as you can see, also, actually, larger farms were also more interested in direct marketing. So potentially at a general level, this is showing that these types of markets might be attractive in the future. I'll come back to this link to protein in a moment, but I think it's interesting that, for example, crops comes out there in that piece of data. This then is a much more kind of European overview of the storyline. So this is the latest EU Agricultural Outlook report for 2023 to 2035. I think they produce these quite regularly, and they have a chapter in it which is all about kind of arable land use, basically. And I've just picked out here a couple of graphs because I think they're quite interesting. So you can see on the left there the EU cereal area in millions of hectares over time. Now, this is not going to change radically, but there is going to be a slight drop they're predicting. And what's also interesting on the right-hand side is the oil seeds and pulses area, which they're predicting will grow. So basically, it's showing us that, or predicting or forecasting, that soybeans and pulses will increase. So we're going to see a relative shift, basically. And it looks like barley in particular is going to slightly decline. So, I mean, you could be skeptical about forecasting, but again, I think as part of our thought experiment, there could be something quite interesting to think about there. And then I thought, well, the other thing that you need, of course, for a different type of protein transition, so one that's less, big business, technocentric, perhaps more social innovation, socio-ecological, is if we want to diversify our cropping systems, then we have to also think about value chain innovation. And the reason we need to do that is because we need to create markets for these diversified cropping systems so that farmers can sell and get a good price, and they can sell a more sort of heterogeneous or varied set of crops than, for example, well, I just grow wheat and it goes off and I don't know where it goes. Most of it probably gets sold as feed wheat or something like that, So if we want farmers to get serious about intercropping and stuff, we need to create markets for them. And this is a company in the UK. I don't know if you've heard of them. They're called Hodmedod's. They're based, I think, over in Suffolk. in East Anglia, and they are an absolutely brilliant company. I'm not here just to promote them or anything, but I think they're fantastic companies. So basically, they're an example of a short food supply chain for pulse and grain markets. So they support and encourage farmers to get into a more diversified cropping profile, and they do a whole bunch of things. They basically act as like a sort of a hub, really. So they, as well as buying the crops, they give advice to farmers, agronomic advice, seed advice. They do public events to consumers to connect local communities into legumes and pulses and stuff. You can read a lot more about them, but I put them in here as an example of the sort of supply chain we might need to be thinking about, for example. And then just in the final part of the story, it's then how do we link this up at a bigger level? So it's fine to have one example like Hodmedod, who are absolutely amazing, but what we probably need to do is to link that to a bigger movement for change. And this is a piece of work that we did a couple of years ago as an outcome of the COVID pandemic, which was about the local food movement. And we were trying to create a new vision for them, basically. And the idea was to position local food as being a force for good, particularly around the resilience and well-being of communities. And there was a series of different factors that we identified, one of which was around building new types of infrastructure to enable positive change. So I think if you wanted to have a protein transition that was farmer-led, one of the big things we'd have to major on would be the infrastructure questions, but also sort of pragmatic strategies to align that into other types of alliances. Because if a farmer needs to change, they need support to do it, basically. So they need to link, it needs to be linked into a kind of bigger agenda, I think. So it'd be interesting to hear what's happening in Ireland, for example, at a much bigger level beyond individual supply chains and individual farms. So I think let me just check. I think I'm fine, actually. I think I've got 4 minutes and I probably won't even need all of that time. So we're going to have a nice bit of time to have a good discussion. So just to close then, hopefully I haven't gone too quickly and used too many social science terms and language. But basically what I've tried to do is to situate the protein transition in a much bigger discussion about what I would refer to as planetary concern. So that's not only about climate change, it's also about those other planetary boundaries that we all are aware of. And in that context, we have an agenda around demeatification, and that's associated partly, at least, with alternative proteins. They are, to some extent, part of this new frontier. But what we're trying to show in our work in the 2023 paper, for example, is that is quite differentiated. So these pathways or kind of business trajectories, they manifest differently in terms of the kind of diffusion of an innovation. But what we think is particularly important from our paper is that we can see how the meat regime itself, the incumbent actors, the big actors in that space, are beginning to show an interest, and that is quite significant. But of course, as people like Phil Howard would say, this can also be critiqued because it could potentially lead to a kind of maintenance of power asymmetries. So with that in mind, my sort of argument really is to think about possibilities that really support farmers to be more resilient. And so I think that gets us into really interesting questions about business models and short food supply chains, which I think the Protein Eye project is in a great place to comment on. But in that regard as well, I would say that it also raises other questions, particularly around this idea of infrastructure, and that's both material and social, I would say. So to enable these new kind of economies of scope, if you like, and diversification, we need to think about how we can support that transition at a bigger level rather than just focusing on farmers and individual supply chains. So I think that takes me pretty much bang up to time. So I'll stop there. Hope that's okay, Lorraine.
Yes, thank you.
Reasonable sense. Shall I stop sharing my?
Yes, you can. That'd be fantastic. Thank you very much, Damian. That was fantastic to see, and it's great to get that social science aspect of it, and also to bring it back then to the farmer level. And of course, as you mentioned, Protein I is really at the latter end of what you were talking about there. So really working with farmers on how we can diversify the crops that we grow here in Ireland, and how we can make short supply chains and make reasonable economies for those farmers working there. And of course, we're working then with grappling with problems such as infrastructure, and then trying to work with other projects within Ireland and coming together to see how we can deal with that. So open for questions for Damian, and maybe I can, as you're getting your questions in, I can just start with one. So I really liked that work that you were doing, looking at the meat companies becoming interested in alternative proteins, and the kind of models you were talking about. There's two things I kind of was thinking as you were talking about that there. And the first was, like, is there particular reasons why they're becoming interested in that market, and can you garnish some of that from other models? And the second one then, when they do get interested in markets such as APs, do they drive growth in certain areas, and do they drive growth in the area that they get interested in?
Yeah, they're really good questions, Lorraine. So we think the reason, so if you use the kind of the multi-level perspective model, what we've detected in the work that we've done is that the reason that they're interested is because of the critique of animal agriculture, basically. So that's linked to this kind of growing societal discourse. A lot of it is linked to climate change, but there's also questions around things like there's a kind of food security part of that within that as well. So basically, they're becoming interested because it's kind of questioning the integrity, if you like, of the animal regime. So what's happening is that they are kind of moving their interests a little bit into these markets. So it's a diversification strategy for these companies, basically. And then they will certainly be driving growth in the sense that what we show, I mean, that table I showed is terrible because it's got so much information in it. But if you look at the detail of it, you can see that what they're doing basically is that they're investing in the development of some of these technologies. But the other thing that's really interesting, which I forgot to mention, is that they also use it as so there's some subtle things going on in the marketing of it. So some of them have rebranded themselves as meat companies to protein companies.
Okay.
So it's a subtle shift in the positioning of the company. So basically what they're doing, we think, is they're responding to the kind of societal and scientific questioning of the animal regime. And so they're looking at these alternative proteins now and thinking, actually, we probably do need to start looking at these, and we may need to start slightly diversifying our portfolio. Not everywhere. So they'll do it in some places. So some of these are global places. So in some parts of the world, there'll be a protein company. In other parts, they may still be a meat company.
Okay. Yes. Yeah.
You see what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's quite interesting to observe how they do it, really.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it is, and I guess there'll be more on it, and it'll come out. There's a question in here on the chat that's come in, and it's relating again, I guess, to the referenced incompetence, and it's asking for it is any commentary on new kids on the block, such as venture capitalists.
Yes.
And what do they add, in particular in relation to cultured meat, for example?
Yes. No, venture capitalists are definitely part of the story, and I think, in fact, what some of the literature would probably suggest that a lot of this is driven by venture capital. So particularly if you look at things like like cellular agriculture, for example, a lot of that is associated with venture capital. So there's been work done by a lady called Julie Guthman, who's based in the US again. Again, that's linked to venture capital. So I think a lot of people would associate a lot of these niche innovations with investment from venture capital. And there's definitely, in our analysis, you can see that. But what's particularly interesting, we think, from I'll call it an MLP perspective, is that when you see incumbent actors, so this is people in the main regime itself, when they start investing as well, then that's quite interesting, because it means that the people in the animal regime are actually paying attention and potentially seeing it as a. So I think it's that mix of venture capital and corporate investment. That's what we see in that, particularly those latter two, the precision fermentation and cellular ag, but also especially the plant-based proteins, because that's a more mature market, you see. So that's the one that's really accelerated. So now it's become quite embedded actually into quite a lot of our mainstream food service. And like, so if you go to a supermarket or you go to a food service, you'll probably get a plant-based alternative, and that's linked to that. So it's that combination, I think.
Yeah, okay, so it's that combination that works.
Yeah,
in that
well,
context.
it's particularly interesting, we think, but venture capital is definitely important and plays a big role.
Okay, very good. And then there's another question here that's going back to that EU projected increase we saw, and I think there was one for pulses. And the question is whether that increase is for animal or human feed, or maybe they didn't break it down.
What's that? Sorry, say that again.
So the EU projected increase in pulses.
Yes. Yeah.
Was that for animal feed or for human feed, for human food?
They didn't specify, as far as I know. What they were predicting was that those pulse. I can't. There is in the report they give you the exact predicted change from what it is in 2023 to what they predict in 2035, and I think they're predicting that there'll be greater demand for these proteins. Some of it linked to kind of policy steers. But there's also another section of that report which is about animal feed. And actually in the animal feed side, they're predicting a decrease in animal feed demand. So it's quite interesting. But I mean, there's no reason why. And in fact, I was looking at it thinking some of this could end up, basically, probably what they're doing is they could grow soya, for example, that will become animal feed. That's very possible. Do you know what I mean? So it's not simple. Disaggregate, so that's very, very possible. I guess what I was trying to say was that if we frame it in the right way, some of these things could be, we could avoid that happening. So we could try and encourage farmers to grow these protein alternatives, but to think about the right types of markets, rather than going, well, I just sell it again, someone, and it just becomes, so soya just becomes the thing that they buy for animal feed. Well, we want to avoid that, don't we?
Yeah, so I think there needs to be good value chain works done.
Yeah,
I think
the
really
value chain bit of the story is critical. So it's fine to get the sort of predictions, and I think that's, the report is interesting for that alone. But to me, the value chain bit's the critical bit then that you've got to add on.
Yeah, absolutely. So that it makes sense to invest and to grow these. There's another question that's come in that follows on from our earlier discussion again, which is, I guess it's in the investment of the meat companies back into alternative proteins. Is that something comparable with big oil companies investing in renewable energies? So that's a question that's come in.
Yeah, what an interesting question. I mean, I guess so. I guess so, to some extent, having not really thought it through properly. I mean, I guess it's an indication that the sort of, should we say, established ways of doing things, or at least we're beginning to see cracks in the system. Let's say, let's not kind of over exaggerate it, but you could certainly see it like that. I mean, if you compare though the proportions of investment and the scale of alternative proteins compared to you know, conventional meat markets, the alternative proteins are still tiny, and investment portfolios relative to that are still tiny. I don't know what it looks like in oil and renewables. I mean, maybe actually the demand to shift to renewables is even greater, perhaps. You might argue, in fact, that that's the case. It probably is, but it would be interesting to look at that, look at those.
Yeah, it could be a good
data.
comparator, right? In
Yeah,
that
I mean, I
context,
think in the MLP, there's loads of papers that use this kind of MLP framework, and actually, I think for some of the kind of energy and transport transitions, the data is much better. So you could do that. It would be quite interesting to do that. That's quite a good question.
Okay, very good. And then you did mention then, Damian, there, I think a kind of a redefinition of protein. Would you like to expand a little bit on that, or what did you mean when you mentioned that?
What did I say, Lorraine?
So
Where
you
did
said
I say that? Sorry.
you were saying the kind of a redefinition of protein. Maybe that was in the context of the companies shifting from being meat companies to protein companies.
Yes.
Was that it?
Yeah. That's what I was referring to there.
Okay.
It's probably not. It's maybe it's rather than it's a redefinition of the company in a way.
Okay. Yes.
So it's like it's like a subtle marketing shift whereby what we found, I think it was Tyson from memory. John knows the details because he really got into these companies. But what we found was that they were changing the way that they presented themselves from being a meat company to being a protein company.
Okay, yeah.
And now that's a very subtle shift, but it's actually quite significant in terms of the way that they're kind of just maneuvering themselves. That's what I was referring to.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
You know what I mean? Yeah.
And then there's just a final question in here that's asking about your opinion with regard to alternative proteins such as insects and seaweeds.
Yes. Yeah. We didn't look at those in detail in our work, but I would certainly. There's been quite a lot of social science work though done on insects. So, for example, I don't know about seaweeds, but insects definitely. So, Alex Sexton's work does that. There's another guy called Chris Bear who's based in Cardiff, and he's got a project at the moment which is looking specifically at insects as a kind of alternative protein economy. I haven't looked at them in much detail for me to comment with authority, only in the sense that they're part of this mix of these new alternative protein economies. But certainly the work of Alex's work and Chris's work in particular would be really good to look at.
Very good. I guess they're just a global part of that.
Yeah, they're part
protein,
of this bigger sort of transition that we're seeing, really. We looked at those four. We did debate whether we should look at insects, but I think we decided that if we think of them as production technologies, they were the four that we looked at were probably the most significant, and it also just made the analysis manageable for us, so we kind of rationalized it that way. But definitely they would be part of the overall umbrella of those types of alternative protein economy.
Very good. Well, I think I draw it to a close then in terms of the questions, and then I just finally like to thank you very much, Damian. That was a fantastic presentation, and it really gave us a lovely insight into some of the social science aspects, and then bringing it back to the farmer, which of course we're trying to do in Protein I as well. So I look forward to further discussions with you on how we're getting on in Protein I as our work emerges out from it. So once again, thank you very much for coming along today and sharing your experiences with us. And thank you very much to all our participants for logging on today and for engaging with the Q&A session. Have a good afternoon, everybody. Thank you.
Take care. Thanks a lot.